I just finished reading a fun and rather obscure old book, and that book is this. This is Rolf in the Woods by Ernest Thompson Seton. This is a novel that was published in 1911. A little bit of background on Ernest Thompson Seton. For those who don't know his name, he's actually most remembered nowadays for the fact that he was one of the founding members of the Boy Scouts of America. That's most of what he's remembered for now. For better and for worse, I suppose, given that the Boy Scouts of America has a little bit of a questionable history in some departments. But Ernest Thompson Seton was also a writer. He was actually quite a prolific writer. If you go and you look up his bibliography, he published a lot of books, a lot of them. And a lot of his novels were animal fiction, some of the kind of earliest examples of animal fiction. And as I've read on Wikipedia, the best source in the world, a lot of his animal fiction was notable and kind of groundbreaking insofar as it portrayed a lot of predator animals, like the wolf and the grizzly bear and others, as like sympathetic protagonists rather than as sort of villains, right? As they were often portrayed before Seton's time. But Rolf in the Woods is not animal fiction. So the book, I should say, takes place in about a century before it was published. So published in 1911, and it opens about 1811, or maybe even a bit earlier than that, maybe like 1810. But anyway, this is the very, very early 19th century in America, specifically in upstate New York. And Rolf is a 15-year-old boy who, at the beginning of the book, is living with an aunt and uncle. His parents died when he was very young, both his mother and his father. He's being raised by an abusive aunt and uncle. The uncle is kind of a drunk and physically abusive. The aunt is not necessarily physically abusive, but also not very nice. And at the beginning of the novel, Rolf decides to run away from his caretakers and start to live with Quanab, who is a Native American man who lives very close to his caretaker's house. And he starts to live with this Native American man named Quanab, and very quickly, Quanab and Rolf actually have to flee town. They have to flee because the people of the town realize that Rolf has left his caretakers and is living with this Native American man in the wilderness, and try to tell them that Rolf will have to go and live with a different adoptive family, and Quanab and Rolf will have none of it. And so they flee north into the Adirondacks, into the Adirondack Mountains, and we just kind of see them as they romp through upstate New York. They do trapping for a winter to make some money, and we read about the process of trapping and the encounters they have with wild animals. We read about their trials and tribulations with people, other trappers, trying to steal their animals that they have trapped for fur. We see a lot of anecdotes involving their dog, Skookum. And that's much of the story. It's much more of a story of vibes than of there being a strong plot. In fact, this book reads a little bit more like a collection of anecdotes or a collection of short stories, honestly, than a linear novel with a beginning, middle, and end. But so for a lot of the book is just devoted to this very loving portrayal of this way of life, of sort of living off the land. We see Rolf and Quanab build their own cabin, set up their own traps, again, have encounters with wild animals, hunt for food, forage for food, cook food. A lot of this book is actually focused on being kind of instructive to the reader about how to live in the wilderness. One thing about some of Ernest Thompson Seton's fiction, which I didn't mention before, but I wanted to bring up, is that some of it was meant to be didactic, specifically didactic for like aspiring Boy Scouts. They were supposed to espouse kind of the skills and values that a Boy Scout should have, including a lot of nature skills, but also including like, you know, being firm in the face of adversity and other sort of you could say somewhat machismo values, right? There's also an undercurrent of patriotism in this novel. Towards the end, Rolf and Quanab get involved with the American Army as scouts in the War of 1812, and that really brings forward a kind of patriotic part of this book, which I wasn't in love with, but I can take it for what it is, that it was probably just meant very much in earnest, and I was okay with it. But like I said, this is much more of a book of vibes than a book of a strong plot. If you have any connection to upstate New York, like I do, I was born and raised in upstate New York. I spent part of pretty much every summer of my childhood in the Adirondack Mountains. If you're like that, if you're from upstate New York, I feel like you might really get a kick out of this, because they're going all over places that you probably know, right? And I just found it really, really charming. One thing that I did want to stop and unpack a little bit, there's a couple things to note in this. First off, anyone who has been paying attention so far will probably be wondering about the portrayal of Quanab, the Native American man in this book, and how problematic it may be. And I will say the book was published in 1911 by a white man, so the portrayal of this Native American individual is not the most sensitive by our standards now. So Quanab is stereotyped in certain ways. He is made to seem kind of like this noble savage kind of person, as not being fit for quote-unquote civilized life and being more suited to life sort of in the wilderness. He kind of speaks in a stereotyped way. He doesn't speak like proper English. He kind of speaks in a, you can say, kind of a primitivized English when he speaks. And the Ernest Thompson Seton doesn't help himself in the preface. There's a very short preface to Rolf in the Woods where Seton talks about a few things, but one thing he talks about is his portrayal of this Native American man. And he specifically responds to certain objections, that people might raise to the way that he portrayed this Native American man. Because we see at various points Quanab sing. He sings these songs, these religious songs, and some of these songs are taken from the Ojibwe, okay? And the Ojibwe are largely located in like the kind of Great Lakes area. There's some Ojibwe, I believe, in Minnesota and North Dakota and just across the border in Canada. That's kind of the area where the Ojibwe, or the Chippewa, as they sometimes are referred to as, are located. And yet Seton has taken Ojibwe songs and put them in the mouth of Quanab, who is not Ojibwe. I believe he's from a fictionalized Native American people, but he's from a people who would be something like, for example, the Algonquin in the Northeast United States. And he kind of responds to people who would criticize this choice to take the traditions of a very different Native American people and put it in the mouth and put it on this man who would be from a completely different nation, right? And he doesn't help himself very much. So this is what he says. Those who know nothing of the race, the Native American race, will scoff and say they never heard of such a thing as a singing and religious, quote-unquote, red man, as he says. Those who know him well will say, yes, but you have given to your Eastern Indian songs and ceremonies which belong to the Western tribes, and which are of different epochs. To the latter I reply, and this is the really cringe part, okay? So this is it. You know that the Western Indians sang and prayed in this way. How do you know that the Eastern ones did not? We have no records, except those by critics, savagely hostile, and contemptuous of all religious observances but their own. The ghost dance song belonged to a much more recent time, no doubt, but it was purely Indian, and it is generally admitted that the races of continental North America were of one stock and had no fundamentally different customs or modes of thought. So basically he's saying that all the Native Americans in North America were all exactly the same. There was no cultural differentiation. And so he has no problem taking Ojibwe cultural traditions and giving them to this northeastern Native American individual. So the portrayal of the Native American man is very problematic by a lot of benchmarks. However, I will make a slight defense of the portrayal of Quanab here. A slight defense. Not really defense, but more just saying that maybe we should grade Ernest Thompson Seton on a bit of a curve. So when you look at the way that Native Americans would have been portrayed at the same time, largely what you would have seen were demonizations, were portrayals of them as thieves, as bandits, as villains. Certainly if you look at the way that they were portrayed in films in the first half of the 20th century and well past the halfway point of the 20th century, in Westerns specifically, they usually were villains, or at best they were just not very well portrayed, right? If they weren't villains, then they certainly were not protagonists and were perhaps portrayed as sort of less than fully civilized, less than fully human. And I think when you compare that to what Ernest Thompson Seton has done in this, I think the comparison is fairly favorable, right? Because Quanab plays a huge role in this book. He is a mentor to Rolf. He teaches Rolf everything he knows about living in the wilderness. Also, I think you do see a fair amount of empathy for Quanab, and not just for Quanab, but for the plight of Native Americans. There are some really moving passages where Quanab talks about the way that his people were slaughtered and driven out of their homes by white men. And he also, at one point, tells Rolf about what happened to his wife. His wife, actually, was kidnapped by slave traders who took her for an escaped slave and presumably shipped her off to the American South. And that's how he lost his wife, and he's not even sure if she's alive or not. And there are other aspects of it, and there's also a lot of attention given to Quanab's religiosity, and the comparison of his religiosity to Rolf's religiosity, with Rolf's religiosity being fairly superficial. With Quanab kind of makes fun of Rolf at one point and says it looks like you only really observe religion on Sundays, right? Because he's a Christian. And so the comparison in that sense is very favorable to Quanab, because he's always observing these religious rituals. And I will say that this novel is also quite pious at times, which, again, it's another thing like the patriotism. You kind of just have to take it for what it is. Again, it's meant, I think, very much in earnest. Again, a little bit problematic. But I feel like there is an attempt at empathy with Native American people in the character of Quanab in this book. And again, I don't say that to excuse the highly problematic aspects of his portrayal, but I think that we should give Seton a little bit of credit there. And so yeah, this book, I did really enjoy it. It's a really charming, again, sort of collection of stories. Kind of the main, I think, theme of the book is sort of the development into manhood, right? And again, it does have kind of a machismo undertone of facing adversity and, staying tough in the face of challenges and all this, which all of which were very much imbued into the Boy Scouts. One other maybe kind of problematic thing I could say about Rolf in the Woods is the female characters. There are really no female characters, like actual characters. There are women who appear, but they are not generally characters, including very much the young woman who Rolf ends up marrying. We know nothing about her personality at all. And there are even some passages in this that you could read as being fairly sexist. There's some passages where Seton talks about men and women talking together and talks about how, the men, have to make sure that their conversation stays fairly, superficial and polite while the women are around. But then when the women leave, they can talk about really interesting things, stuff like that. Again, it's rather fleeting, that aspect of the book. And I don't want to excuse it, right? I don't want to just say that Seton was of his time, quote unquote, because of course there were many male writers and female writers writing fiction with extremely interesting and sophisticated and complex female characters at the time. So he's not excused just because he wrote in the late 19th and early 20th century. But again, I think if you take it for what it is, this can be a very enjoyable read. The writing is fairly decent. It's nothing to celebrate the prose, but it's well written, I think, in many points. There are some rather charming passages, descriptive passages. So, anyway, I will leave it at that. If this sounds like fun, read it. If it sounds like the drawbacks to it are going to be too much for you, then you won't find any judgment from me. But I did want to talk about it because I felt like I had a lot to say about Rolf in the Woods. And it's kind of an obscure book, right? It's kind of fallen into obscurity. No one I know knows about this or even has mentioned Ernest Thompson Seton. So, anyway, I'll leave it at that. And I'll talk to you all again soon.